They said it was just a signature, just ink on paper, like all the others. 9 names already sat there in neat rows, lined up like dominoes. All that remained was mine, the last domino they expected to fall. The report in front of me declared, without a single stutter, that the product conformed to all safety requirements. I almost laughed. Requirements don't bend, they break. And I had seen the break. I could still picture the lab tests, tubes leaking under pressure, readings spiking, alarms chirping. Not glitches, not acceptable margins of error, but faults. Faults that meant one day, some unsuspecting doctor or patient would discover just how expensive denial could be. The numbers told the story, and the story ended badly. Yet here they were, smiling as if ink could erase physics. The production director leaned back in his chair, all confidence and cufflinks. "You're overthinking it. We need to move forward. Compliance is just a checkbox." "Check the wrong box," I said. "And you're not moving forward. You're burying people." Across the table, the CFO gave me that rehearsed corporate grin, the kind that says he's already picked out the yacht he'll buy with his bonus. "Our competitors don't hesitate. You can't make perfection the enemy of profit." Profit. Always profit. I tapped the pen against the blank line, imagining what it would feel like to give in. The relief, the false calm, the weight off my shoulders. Until the first lawsuit, the first accident, the first headline. I saw myself in a courtroom, my name read aloud as the man who signed. And in that moment, the pen felt heavier than iron. I set it down. "No!" The word rang sharper than I expected, slicing through the room like glass breaking. No one spoke. Even the air conditioner seemed to pause. Then, slowly, the CEO rose at the head of the table. He didn't look angry. He looked certain. "Then we have no place for you here," he said. "Effective immediately." The script unfolded exactly as they had planned. HR materialized with a folder, my badge was deactivated before I hit the lobby, and colleagues suddenly found the ceiling tiles fascinating as I walked past. My desk had already been boxed, as though they knew my principles would outlast their patience. But as I stepped into the sunlight, unemployed and officially disposable, I wasn't afraid. I was almost amused. They thought firing me would bury the truth. But truth doesn't bury. It waits. It lingers in test results, in regulatory databases, in the memory of the man they'd just pushed out the door. They didn't know it yet, but the countdown had already started. The company called itself Medtronics, a name designed to sound sleek, futuristic, inevitable. Their slogan, "Engineering Tomorrow's Health," was plastered across every wall, every brochure, every lobby screen. Patients in smiling stock photos stared out from the posters like saints in a cathedral. Except the devotion here wasn't to medicine, but to profit. From the outside, Medtronics looked unstoppable. The headquarters gleamed with glass walls and brushed steel. Visitors marveled at the atrium's indoor waterfall, as though trickling water proved integrity. Investors ate it up, employees bragged to their families, and executives posed on magazine covers. But if you spent enough time behind those glass walls, you saw the cracks. And not the hairline kind. These were structural. I joined 10 years ago when the company was half its current size and twice as cautious. Back then, quality assurance wasn't a nuisance. It was the foundation. I was hired to run the QA department, a modest team of grim-eyed engineers who believed safety meant something. We combed through every test result, documented every failure, and argued fiercely until products truly met standards. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And for a while, Medtronics cared. As the years went on, growth became the altar, and safety the sacrifice. New management moved in, armed with MBAs and catchphrases. They worshipped speed to market, disruption, and first mover advantage. What they really meant was shortcuts. My role, the guardian of inconvenient truths, slowly shifted from essential to expendable. Still, I kept my routines. I arrived early, before the lobby filled with latte foam and optimism, carrying my dented thermos of black coffee. I scrawled notes in a battered notebook, recording test numbers like they were confessions. Colleagues teased me. Old school, they said. Paranoid. They preferred Evan in marketing, who could sell ice to the Arctic, or Sabrina in strategy, who could spin any defect into user-adjacent opportunity. And then there were the executives. Richard Blake, CEO, believed in two things. The market was always right, and Richard Blake was always smarter than the market. His suits cost more than my annual grocery bills, and his pep talks landed like sermons from a prophet of profit. Diane Mercer, production director, my direct nemesis, saw QA as sandbags slowing down her river of output. She measured her worth in units shipped, and anyone raising alarms was just negative energy. Carl Hendricks, CFO, carried a calculator where his heart should be. He didn't care if products were safe. He cared about margins. I once overheard him say, "If it fails less than 5% of the time, we can budget for litigation." He wasn't joking. I dealt with them daily, carrying test results into meetings where numbers that screamed danger were treated as mere speed bumps. My job was to translate risk into reality, but reality was a language they no longer wanted to hear. The breaking, I documented everything: photos, reports, timestamps. I brought them to the production meeting, laid them out like evidence in court. Diane brushed them aside. "Edge cases," she said. "No product is perfect." Richard smiled that CEO smile. "Hospitals are desperate for modernization. We can't miss this window." Carl calculated aloud. "If defects surface later, warranty costs will be manageable compared to lost market share." I stared at them, wondering when exactly healthcare had been redefined as acceptable loss. Meanwhile, my department shrank. Positions went unfilled, audits were delayed, and responsibilities quietly shifted to production. I found myself excluded from email threads, then meetings, then entire project updates. My badge access to certain labs vanished overnight. When I raised the issue with HR, they gave me the corporate shrug: realignment of resources. But I wasn't stupid. I saw the writing on the wall. I was the last obstacle, the lone gatekeeper, standing between them and a lucrative launch, and like all obstacles, I was being prepared for removal. At home, the strain showed. I lived alone in a small apartment, my shelves cluttered with technical manuals and coffee mugs from conferences I barely remembered attending. I cooked simple meals, read dog-eared novels, and tried to forget that every day at work felt like holding back a flood with bare hands. My only companion was my cat, Morris, who treated my persistence with the same apathy he treated everything else. Some nights, I asked myself if I should just sign. Scribble the ink, take the paycheck, and pretend ignorance. After all, wasn't that what everyone else was doing? But then I imagined a headline: "Faulty infusion pump leads to patient deaths," and underneath, my name, immortalized as the man who approved it. Sleep never came on those nights. The closer we got to launch, the louder the pressure became. Meetings stretched late into the evening, each one more aggressive than the last. "Why are you blocking progress?" Diane demanded. "Do you want competitors to win?" Carl dangled threats about career-limiting decisions. Even Richard tried charm, promising promotions and stock options, but my answer never changed. I had a rule, simple and unshakable. If you can't stand behind the product in front of a grieving family, you don't sign. They hated me for it. I could feel the whispers in the halls, the awkward silences when I entered a room. My inbox filled with FYI messages, never, please advise. In every way that mattered, I was already gone. The firing itself would just be paperwork. Still, I clung to the belief that the truth mattered, that someone had to draw the line, even if everyone else trampled it. What I didn't realize then was that being pushed out wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs unraveling. The week before that meeting felt like watching a magician practice misdirection in slow motion. While everyone stared at the left hand, launch dates, press kits, a glossy demo unit under perfect lighting, the right hand quietly removed my keys. My calendar started thinning first. The recurring product readiness sync I'd hosted for years disappeared, reappeared under a new name, and then reappeared again with a smaller guest list that no longer included me. The nightly integrity digest I'd built, hashes, variance bands, failure flags, stopped landing in my inbox. "Automation cleanup," Ait said brightly, as though unhooking the fire alarms made the building safer. When I asked for the new route, Diane told me those files were too technical for broad distribution, which was rich considering my job title. On Tuesday, I found a laminated testing excellence framework taped to the lab door. The framework's centerpiece was a rainbow pyramid with contextual quality at the top. Below it, in smaller type, a line that might as well have been written in crayon. "Failure is evidence of potential, not of defect." I peeled the sheet off and left it on Diane's chair. Later, I saw it taped back up, this time with a signature from marketing. They kept telling me our cracks were edge cases. I kept showing them edges. Under thermal cycling, routine temperature swings modeled on hospital conditions, the pump's polymer housing developed micro fissures around the seam near the inlet. Not always, not even often, but often enough that a competent engineer would refuse to sleep on it. Add vibration, a mild solvent in a common medication, and a certain humidity band, and the fissures widened. The leak rate never exploded, it whispered, a creep of contamination that would show up as a mystery infection days later. Edge cases don't look like explosions. They look like corners of an obituary. Diane's solution was to tweak the conditions until they passed. "Hospitals aren't freezing warehouses," she said, dialing down the lower bound of the cycle. "Let's be realistic." When the variance band still misbehaved, she suggested reducing the number of cycles. "Our users won't run them nonstop." When the housing still cracked on the 90th cycle, she proposed an interpretation. Monitor and field. She wanted to redefine failing pre-launch as gathering post-launch data. Carl nodded so hard I worried for his cervical spine. Midweek, I caught a junior analyst adjusting a spreadsheet. Not falsifying, nothing so crude, but normalizing outliers into oblivion. "Diane asked me to align this with the new acceptance narrative," she said, cheeks flush with the effort of loyalty. I asked her to print the raw log, and then stepped aside while she stared at the file like it was a language she didn't speak. When she left, I pulled the hashes from my archive and stapled them to the printout. Numbers are patient. They wait for their day in court. HR, which had never noticed my existence, suddenly remembered I needed tone coaching. A cheerful specialist with a terrifying smile scheduled a session about building bridges with results-oriented stakeholders. She used phrases like meeting people where they are and finding yes. I asked what yes would look like to a family whose child receives a contaminated dose. She blinked, wrote something in her tablet, and kindly suggested I take a mindfulness seminar. Richard tried charm. He stopped by the lab, tie slung over his shoulder like a trophy. "You and I want the same thing," he said, voice pitched confidentially. "Safer care, faster. Your standards are admirable, but momentum matters. We launch, we monitor, we iterate. That's the modern approach." He clapped my shoulder. "Let's not be the Department of No." Carl tried math. He slid a sheet across my desk, a cascade of small numbers that added up to a giant shrug. "Projected failure rate under revised parameters is under 0.5%, he said. "We can ring-fence warranty and litigation reserves." He smiled, the accountant who had found room in the budget for regret. Besides, the upside dwarfs the risk. I asked him what percentage of their children he'd consider within reserves. He pulled the sheet back. Diane tried menace. "You are making this personal," she said in the corridor outside the lab, low enough that only the walls could hear. "You are undermining me in front of my team. You will stop." I told her I wasn't undermining her. I was describing the ground we were both standing on. "There's no ground," she snapped. "There's market." She turned on her heel, the argument over in her mind because she'd stopped listening. They staged a demonstration for a prospective hospital client the next day. The unit on the table preened under soft lights, its casing so spotless it might have been painted. The demo ran cool, calm, perfect. I watched the prep and saw the slight. A pre-chilled fluid bag to tame thermal spikes, and a firmware build locked to a prior revision that never survived our stress suite. When I pointed it out, Sabrina from Strategy cooed. "We're illustrating intended use, not testing extremes." Intention, it turns out, is a wonderful disinfectant until you meet a pathogen. By Thursday night, I was the only one in the lab, the exhaust hum a metronome against thoughts I didn't want. The pump on my bench did what all the others did when you asked the same honest question enough times. The fissure widened. A bead of fluid purled, trembled, grew. A camera above the bench recorded it without judgment. I sat there, alone with the bead and the hum, and realized the decision had already been made. Only not by me. I could choose to sign and become part of a story I despised, or I could refuse and be written out. The truth didn't care either way. It would do what truth does. Wait, and then arrive. Carl cornered me in my office that night with a folder labeled retention. Inside, a promotion if I agreed to collaborative launch parameters, a 6-figure bonus, and a pre-drafted statement for me to read at the all-hands about quality as a shared journey. The statement had my name on it. It read like a hostage letter. "You deserve to be recognized," he said. "Take yes." "Recognition isn't the same as responsibility," I said, sliding the folder back. "And I'm not selling either." He sighed, something like pity flashing across his face and disappearing like a fish. "Be careful," he said, which sounded more like advice than a threat, and somehow worse because of it. Friday morning, I arrived to find my badge no longer opened Lab B. It blamed an overzealous access policy. Diane shrugged. "We need to keep the space clean for demo units." Evan from marketing swept by in a blazer patterned like static, asking where he could find a pump for a photo shoot with a surgeon influencer. "Preferably the shiny one," he added, as though some were built to be brave and others built to be Instagrammable. By the time the meeting notice hit my screen, executive sign-off, final QA conformance, I already knew the choreography. I printed the raw logs. I placed the photos in a neat stack. I took my battered notebook, the one with a decade of numbers and small, stubborn truths. And I walked into the boardroom where everything gleamed. They hadn't expected me to bring paper. Paper offends modern men who prefer slides. I laid the evidence down and walked them through the failure curve like a physician delivering a diagnosis. No melodrama, no voice raised, just data. Diane rolled her eyes at cycle 90. Carl asked if the sample size justified such a harsh interpretation. Richard smiled, and the smile turned into the line about misalignment, and then the words that made their way into the hook like they'd been waiting for a spotlight. Effective immediately. Security didn't escort me. They didn't need to. Humiliation is self-propelling. By the time I reached my office, someone had already tucked my belongings into 2 cardboard boxes. The coffee mug with the chip on the rim. A photo from an old conference where everyone still believed compliance was a virtue. A faded plant that had done its best under bad lighting. I took my notebook. I left the rest. I told the junior analyst at the door to keep the lab window open when she ran thermal cycles, and she nodded with a fear that hurt to watch. In the lobby, the digital waterfall kept trickling, proof that optics never break. A pair of visitors snapped selfies with the slogan behind them while a receptionist whispered into a phone, trying to sound calm. I stepped into the sunlight, the city bright and indifferent, and waited for the anger to arrive. It didn't. Or it did, but in a shape I didn't recognize. Quiet, dense, a kind of grief for a company that had once known better. I realized I had run out of arguments. Not facts, those I had in abundance, but the kind of arguments that change minds. There is a point past which the only persuasion left is consequence. And consequence has its own tempo. I walked 2 blocks to a cafe that still wrote orders on paper cups. I sat by the window and opened my notebook to the page where I'd copied the serial numbers from the failed batch, the timestamps, the variance bands. On the next page, months ago, I had written 3 phone numbers in small, meticulous script. The middle one belonged to the commission that exists for days when companies confuse tomorrow's health with today's earnings. I didn't call. Not yet. The hook had already happened. The firing was their scene, not mine. My part, for the moment, was silence and a coffee cooling beside a notebook full of waiting. In the building I'd just left, they would be congratulating themselves on decisive leadership. In a different building, in a different part of the city, a clerk would be processing a submission I'd filed weeks earlier, the kind that doesn't trend on social media but does trigger calendars in windowless rooms. Conflict, I've learned, isn't the sound of a door slamming. It's the hush that follows when everyone decides what story they want to tell themselves. They had chosen theirs. I had chosen mine. The truth had chosen neither. It had simply started walking. The night I walked out of Metatronics with my cardboard boxes, I didn't head straight home. Instead, I detoured to a quiet diner 2 blocks from the train station, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who calls everyone hun. I set the boxes beside me, ordered burnt coffee and a plate of fries, and opened my notebook. The pages were dense with a decade of scribbles, serial numbers, failure bands, cross-referenced reports. To a stranger, it looked like chaos. To me, it was a map. And maps, if you're patient, lead somewhere. Months earlier, when I realized Richard and Diane weren't just bending rules but breaking them, I started creating copies. Not of everything. That would have been obvious. Just enough. A photograph of a failed pump under magnification. A log file hash saved on a thumb drive. An email confirming we had suppressed certain stress cycles for market alignment. Each piece was small, deniable on its own. Together, they told a story. I wasn't building a bomb. I was building a mirror. The crucial move wasn't the evidence, though. It was the submission. A quiet, unglamorous form I filed through the Federal Product Safety Commission portal 6 months earlier. A notice of concern. I didn't sign my name in bold letters or march into a journalist's office with a manila envelope. I simply uploaded the documentation, attached the lab photos, and clicked submit. A confirmation email appeared in my inbox. Case logged, pending review. Bureaucracy moves at the pace of erosion, but erosion doesn't stop. Every month since I'd checked the portal, the case status stayed the same, received under evaluation. I didn't push, I didn't prod. I just made sure the breadcrumb trail remained intact. If Metatronics launched on schedule, the regulators would be forced to act. And now that my name had been scrubbed from the payroll, the timing was no longer a variable. It was a fuse. Back in my apartment, I set the notebook on the kitchen table next to Morris, who sniffed it once and then sprawled across it as if to declare ownership. I brewed fresh coffee, opened my laptop, and logged into the commission's portal. There it was, my case, still humming quietly in the database, waiting for a trigger. I uploaded one more file, the most recent thermal cycle failures, complete with timestamps from the week before my termination. The system accepted them, stamped the case updated, and sent me another automated email. No fanfare, just a record. That's the thing about revenge. Hollywood makes it look like fireworks and explosions. In reality, it's a form, a deadline, a line of code that sits in a database until someone notices it's red instead of green. The next morning, while Metatronics executives were no doubt high-fiving over my removal, I sat at the same diner, notebook open, sipping weak coffee. Outside the window, commuters rushed past with their phones and their stress, oblivious to the quiet clock ticking inside a government server. Somewhere in Washington, an analyst would see the updated file. Somewhere in a cubicle, a caseworker would put a sticky note on the file. Potential urgency, launch pending, and sooner rather than later, a team of inspectors would get the order to show up unannounced. I didn't need to lift a finger. By midweek, my prediction proved true. A former colleague, one of the few who hadn't yet cut ties, sent me a late-night text. Heard rumors. Regulatory team scheduled a site visit. Diane looks like she swallowed a lemon. I smiled into the darkness, closed my phone, and let sleep take me for the first time in weeks. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I wasn't hacking servers. I wasn't sneaking into labs. I wasn't plotting sabotage. I had simply let the truth exist in the one place they couldn't spin it. Official records. A bad report inside the company could be buried, rewritten, or explained away. A bad report in a federal database? That's a tombstone. 2 days later, another text came through. Regulators in the building, pulled units from production line, CEO losing it. I read it between bites of toast, almost disappointed at how anticlimactic it felt. No explosions, no grand showdown. Just men in suits with clipboards, walking through shiny halls and asking for documents Diane couldn't produce without tripping over her own lies. Some people crave the drama of revenge, the shouting, the confrontation, the moment where the villain realizes who struck them. Not me. I preferred this, sitting in a booth with my coffee while, across town, Richard's empire unraveled in sterile conference rooms. Revenge isn't about noise, it's about inevitability. At one point that week, HR called my personal phone. Their tone was sugary but taut. We may have overlooked some forms during your exit. Would you be open to a quick signature? Just to clear up loose ends? Loose ends. That's what they called 43 pages of safety compliance. I let the silence hang until the caller began to squirm, then answered softly. I think you already cleared me up. I hung up before they could reply. I didn't need closure. I didn't need apologies. I needed only the comfort of knowing that while they had tried to bury me under paperwork, I had quietly placed a shovel in the regulator's hand. The knock on Metatronics' door came at 9:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not my knock, of course. I was 2 miles away, sipping burnt diner coffee and reading the paper. But the kind of knock that echoes through glass lobbies and makes receptionists suddenly forget their scripts. 3 federal inspectors, badges displayed, clipboards tucked beneath arms, walked through the revolving doors with the calm of people who already know how the story ends. By 9:30, the Slack channels were panicking. A former colleague, still sympathetic enough to forward me screenshots, sent a stream of frantic messages. Regulators in the building, Diane pacing, Richard furious, they're pulling random units off the line. One message stood out. Why didn't QA flag this earlier? The irony nearly choked me on my toast. Inside, I could imagine the scene with cinematic clarity. Richard, red-faced but still clinging to bravado, shaking hands with inspectors like they were guests at a charity gala. Diane whispering sharp instructions to engineers, her smile brittle as glass. Carl in the background, calculating liabilities in real time, sweat glistening on his temples. The inspectors, unfazed, splitting up, opening cabinets, demanding raw logs, the very ones I'd archived in my notebook and quietly uploaded months ago. By noon, the news reached the press. Not headlines yet, but murmurs. an investigative reporter tweeting about a possible compliance review at Medtronics. The stock price dipped 0.5%, then a full percent. By the time Richard saw it, the damage was irreversible. Stock ticks are sharks. They smell blood before the victim even realizes they're bleeding. That afternoon, the inspectors held their first findings meeting. I wasn't there, of course, but the updates trickled out through texts. Stress tests failed, documentation incomplete, batch logs inconsistent. Diane tried to insist the failures were anomalies. One inspector asked her to produce the original variance reports. When she couldn't, he asked why they were missing. She stammered something about data realignment. That phrase would later appear, word for word, in a government memo underlined 3 times in red. By evening, production was halted. Not paused. Halted. Units in process were sealed, boxed, and tagged for evidence. Forklifts that had hummed all morning now sat silent, their operators staring at phones, calculating how long severance pay would stretch. Employees whispered in hallways, their footsteps muffled by the heavy presence of inevitability. The next morning, headlines screamed, "Medtronics under federal investigation, safety failures in infusion pump." Reporters camped outside headquarters, cameras hungry for executives scurrying to cars. Richard gave a statement, rehearsed to death but still ragged at the edges. "We take safety seriously. This is a routine review. We are cooperating fully." The footage showed his jaw clench on the word routine. No one believed him. I watched the clip from my apartment, Morris asleep on my lap, and marveled at the poetry. They had fired me for refusing to sign a line that read, "Conforms to all safety requirements." Now, in letters 10 feet tall, the world was reading the opposite. Fails to conform. By Thursday, hospitals began canceling contracts. Not small clinics, the flagship clients Medtronics had built its empire on. One after another, terse press releases appeared. "In light of ongoing investigations, we are suspending our relationship with Medtronics." The stock price tumbled faster. Richard held emergency all-hands meetings, assuring staff that everything was under control. But even the interns could see the panic in his eyes. Carl tried financial gymnastics, pressing investors, promising recovery, downplaying the scope. But the auditor's interim report leaked, and the numbers were damning. Defect rates far above acceptable limits, safety checks bypassed, entire categories of stress testing omitted. The report used a phrase no company wants to see attached to its name: systemic negligence. By Friday, the dominoes were in freefall. A whistleblower story broke. My story, though my name stayed anonymous in the first wave. A former QA manager refused to sign off on defective reports and was terminated. Shortly after, federal authorities were alerted. The words refused and terminated carried weight. Investors didn't just see failure. They saw betrayal, liability, lawsuits stacked like cordwood. The scene inside the boardroom must have been biblical. Richard shouting, Diane on the verge of tears, Carl throwing spreadsheets like life preservers to a ship that was already upside down. The inspectors sitting calmly, recording every excuse, every contradiction. Truth doesn't raise its voice. It just takes notes. And then came the blacklisting. The commission issued an interim directive. Medtronics is barred from distributing infusion pumps until compliance is reestablished. The order hit like a hammer. Every hospital contract became void overnight. Competitors swooped in like vultures, offering safe alternatives at discounted rates. Clients fled not because they wanted to, but because they had to. No one can buy from a company stamped non-compliant. That evening, I returned to the diner across from headquarters. From my booth by the window, I watched executives exit one by one, ties loosened, faces pale, clutching phones like lifelines. A few employees carried boxes just like I had days earlier, but without the satisfaction. Their jobs weren't sacrifices to principle. They were casualties of arrogance. The waitress topped off my coffee. "Busy across the street?" she asked, nodding toward the chaos. "Very," I said. I raised the mug in a private toast, not to victory, but to inevitability. They had built their empire on a lie. I had simply refused to sign my name to it. That refusal was the crack in the dam. Now the flood was doing the work for me. By Sunday, Metatronics was a punchline. Memes circulated, photos of the glossy atrium tagged "Engineering Tomorrow's Excuses." A parody Twitter account named Metatronics QO posted fake safety slogans. If it breaks, it builds character. Employees scrambled on LinkedIn, rebranding their exits as seeking new opportunities. Diane's profile vanished altogether. Richard stopped appearing in public. Carl resigned, citing personal reasons. But the most satisfying headline came Monday morning. Metatronics permanently blacklisted from federal contracts pending safety review. Blacklisted. The word glared from the screen like a tattoo that couldn't be removed. For a healthcare company, blacklisting wasn't a setback. It was a death sentence. I sat at my kitchen table, notebook open, and reread the pages that had started it all. Numbers, graphs, photos of fissures under magnification, quiet, stubborn evidence. I thought about the boardroom where they'd mocked me for clinging to edge cases. Now the edges had cut them to pieces. And the best part? I hadn't shouted, sabotaged, or stormed the gates. I had simply told the truth, documented it, and refused to be erased. They had fired me for that refusal. In doing so, they'd ensured the truth would surface on its own terms, in its own time. When the commission finally publishes their full report, Richard will be a footnote in a case study about corporate hubris. Diane will be a cautionary tale at industry conferences. Her name whispered like a curse. Carl will retreat into consulting, teaching companies how to avoid QA pitfalls without ever admitting he caused one. And me? I'll still be here, drinking burnt coffee, scribbling in notebooks, watching arrogance implode under the weight of its own lies. Revenge didn't require me to fight. It required me to wait. And waiting, it turns out, is the sharpest weapon of all. On the morning the blacklist became permanent, the city looked exactly the same. Buses hissed at stops, bicycles threaded between taxis, and a woman in a red coat argued into her phone about soup. Catastrophes rarely leave scorch marks on the skyline. They settle into filings and footnotes, into calendars flipped to closed, into keycards that no longer blink green. I made coffee, fed Morris, and opened the laptop to read what everyone else would read after lunch. The commission's notice formalized in dense paragraphs. The word barred repeated with the mechanical certainty of a stamp. Metatronics issued one last statement, blaming confusion, supply chain variances, and interpretations of testing frameworks. They did not blame greed, because greed never hires a publicist. Their logo still looked clean at the top of the page, as if design could launder intent. I closed the tab and watched steam lift off my cup like a small weather system, and thought about how quiet justice really is. Not a gavel, a line at the end of a memo. The calls kept coming for a while. A recruiter promised a mission-driven culture, an equity that would change my life. An investor wanted background purely off the record. A reporter asked if I felt vindicated. Vindication is a strange word. It suggests a parade. What I felt was simpler, the relief of setting down something heavy I'd carried too far. I told the reporter no comment and meant it. I wasn't the story. The story was the fissure that became a crack, that became a river, and the people who insisted the river was a mirage until they drowned. I started walking in the afternoons, a habit I'd once dismissed as something other people did when they ran out of emails. The park smelled like cut grass and a hint of rain. A kid chased a soccer ball with the single-minded joy adults can't seem to recover without permission. I bought a book from a sidewalk cart because the cover made me curious, then read 3 chapters on a bench without looking at my phone. No one demanded a signature there. No one asked me to round any corners off the truth. Sometimes, at dusk, I'd pass the Metatronics building out of morbid geography. The atrium still glittered, the waterfalls still performed, but the lobby guards had a new posture, the loose caution of people who know the rumor mill better than the press. A delivery truck idled outside more than once, its cargo uncertain, its driver bored. Through the glass, I saw a banner being rolled and taped into a tube. The slogan, "Engineering Tomorrow's Health Defeated by a Cardboard Cylinder." Tomorrow, it turned out, had better engineers. I kept the notebook, of course. It sits now on a shelf beside old manuals and conference lanyards, not as a trophy, but as a ledger of choices. I don't open it often. When I do, I'm surprised by how ordinary the pages look. Digits in neat columns, timestamps like fence posts, photos that would bore anyone who hasn't watched a bead of fluid grow with the patience of weather. There is nothing heroic on those pages, just the discipline to say no and the patience to let the right ears hear it. An email arrived from an unfamiliar hospital address a week after the blacklist. Not a contract offer, not a request for comment. A line nurse, anonymous, wrote that she'd seen the news and wanted to say thank you, whoever I was, for refusing to sign. "We are short-staffed and tired," the message read, "and we don't need more variables that break when lives are attached." I replied with 2 words, "Stay stubborn." She sent back a heart. I didn't show that to anyone. Some gratitudes don't belong on resumes. I won't pretend I never felt anger. Anger visits in small, unexpected ways. The memory of a smirk across a boardroom table. The way an intern parroted a line about contextual quality. The folder on my desk labeled retention, like a bribe wrapped in stationery. But anger doesn't know where to go once the building is empty. It circles a while, then gets bored and leaves. What stays is something quieter, heavier, and better. The conviction that facts matter, even when they're inconvenient. That there is a cost to every corner cut. That sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a future stranger is refuse a present fraud. One day, months from now, Richard will shake someone else's hand in a different lobby and call it a fresh start. Diane will reappear with a softened bio and a louder smile. Carl will write a white paper about resilience through transparency and forget to include the chapter on arithmetic with human beings in it. The building will take a new tenant with a new slogan and a new waterfall, because cities are excellent at shedding skins. None of that will change what happened. A signature withheld, a product stopped, a story that didn't end with a headline about a child. As for me, I'm not in a hurry. I answer the calls I want to answer. I read more. I fix the dripping faucet I kept promising to fix. I take the long way to the market because the long way has trees. Maybe I'll consult again. Maybe I won't. The future is a door I don't need to kick open for it to swing. The measure of this ending isn't what happens to my career graph. It's the absence of a different story that never had to be written. They thought firing me would erase the truth. But truth isn't ink, and I wasn't the page. In the end, they blacklisted themselves. I just declined to join the list. And when people ask what I did, I tell them the only answer that belongs in a ledger. I stood where the evidence stood, and I didn't move.